Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take source materials, cut right through the noise, and pull out the crucial insights you need, fast. Today, we're diving into a really interesting document. It's titled Key Principles in Following the Apostles' Vision. Think of it like trying to understand the playbook, the methods the very first followers of Jesus used to spread their message and, well, build communities. Okay, let's be really clear up front. We're not here to debate the theology behind this, whether these principles are right or wrong. Our goal, sticking strictly to this document, is to unpack the practical how and why it argues these early methods were effective. What were the core ideas driving their approach, at least according to this analysis?
That's exactly it. This source is really a summary. It looks at the apostles' practices, their understanding of Jesus, especially his death and resurrection, and the role of the Holy Spirit. And it boils all that down into 64 distinct principles. It's focused specifically on their model for making disciples, planting churches, and building what the document calls movements. So our job here is to extract the really significant takeaways from those 64 points. What are the main themes? What might seem surprising? And crucially, what does the document suggest are the practical implications of this specific historical approach?
Right. And why should you care? Well, because this document paints a picture of early faith communities that might seem, frankly, radically different from a lot of what we see today. It highlights what they apparently prioritize, what they maybe deliberately avoided, and the specific ways it argues they grew so quickly. It's a chance to explore a potentially unfamiliar model. Okay, let's jump in. The document kicks things off by hammering home one absolute core idea, the centrality of Jesus.
Absolutely central.
Principle number 2 says, he was the essential frame for, well, everything. Redefined their theology, how they interpreted prophecy, their doctrine, even their sense of destiny.
Yeah, and it's not just a passing mention. It's everywhere. Principle 9 says Jesus was the reference point for basically every issue they tackled. Principle 10 points out Paul's main way of interpreting things in his letters was always going back to Jesus. The document suggests this foundation, laid early, guides everything, not just beliefs, but actual lives, how churches operated.
So, practically speaking, what did that mean for, say, a new believer? Principle 3 suggests they weren't bogged down with complex theology right away. Instead, the focus was teaching them how to think theologically, but always within that specific frame. Jesus' death, his resurrection, and the Holy Spirit's empowerment.
Right. Less is more, essentially. That's principle 8. The argument is that a simpler foundation actually cultivates deeper, more genuine faith.
And this wasn't just abstract theory, right?
No, not at all. The document argues it became incredibly practical. Principle 23 talks about status reversal, something it links directly to what it calls Christ's cruciformity.
Okay, cruciformity and status reversal. Can you unpack what the document means by those terms?
Sure. Cruciformity basically refers to the pattern of Jesus' life shaped like a cross, meaning humility, self-sacrifice, identifying with the marginalized. And this, the document argues, leads to status reversal, flipping conventional ideas of power and importance on their head.
So being low is high, in a sense.
Kind of, yeah. And Principle 23 argues this cruciformity, this embracing service and lowliness, was meant to be the defining feature of the early Oikos churches, these household communities.
Wow. So not just a nice idea, but an actual organizing principle.
Exactly. The document even suggests that suffering, like Christ's, was viewed almost as a distinct strategy in planting and growing these communities. That's Principles 21 and 22. It even links baptism, in Principle 12, into Christ directly with the sacrificial nature of God, something Paul apparently emphasized. It's presented as deeply integrated.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit because this next part feels really counterintuitive compared to many modern church structures. Principle 19 paints this picture of the Oikos churches that's, well, pretty startling.
Yeah, it is.
It says, no buildings, no dependence on outside money or jobs or social status, and no clergy laity hierarchy.
Right, which immediately raises the question the document tries to answer. How on earth did they operate? How did they grow without all the stuff we often think is essential?
And the answer is?
The document's argument is that this lack of structure, this simplicity, was precisely what made them, and I quote, refreshingly simple, missional, and engaging. That's hashtag 19.
And Principle 20 adds a really crucial detail. These weren't just temporary house groups, right?
Exactly. The document insists they were seen as complete churches from the get-go, not starter kits waiting to become real churches once they got a building or a professional leader.
What's fascinating, too, is how relational this all sounds. Principle 4 says Paul's first journey deliberately followed existing networks.
Yeah, relational streams, family ties, trade routes, ethnic connections. The document calls them ethno-connections.
And then Principle 17 says his second journey focused specifically on planting within Oikos units, households.
Leveraging those existing social fabrics.
So they tapped into who people already knew?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they actively looked for what the document calls persons of peace. That's Principles 31 and 62.
Persons of peace.
Individuals who were receptive, open to the message, and could kind of open doors within their own social circles. This very organic, network-based strategy, the document claims, allowed them to establish a presence in new districts really quickly.
It sounds incredibly resourceful, like Principle 26 mentioning planting teams, literally working normal jobs in the marketplace.
Right, working alongside people, staying in the homes of new contacts, not separate.
And Principle 15 makes that bold claim. Outside funding wasn't necessary because the core activity, just engaging neighbors, colleagues, family, didn't cost anything.
Yeah, the document summarizes this model in Principle 36. It describes these churches as simple, small, reproducible, no-cost, multiplying, and functionally complete. The argument is they found the resources they needed: people, meeting places, even funds in the harvest itself, as Principle 35 puts it, sustainability built from within.
This idea of self-sufficiency seems tightly linked to another huge theme in the document.
Empowerment.
Empowering everyone.
Absolutely key.
Principle 5 states that new believers and these new churches were immediately given total responsibility for God's mission in their area. And the document argues this wasn't just delegation, it was essential for their own spiritual growth and maturity.
And Principle 6 doubles down on that. They were taught explicitly to trust God's Spirit, not to become dependent on the planting team that started things off.
Which forces a kind of reliance on God, not people.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what happens to long-term growth when the founding team intentionally makes themselves unnecessary?
Speaking of the team leaving, Principle 48 presents that as a positive strategy for multiplication.
Right. It argues the leader moving on is actually vital because it forces new local leaders to emerge and take ownership. It affirms them.
And the definition of leadership itself is interesting here. Principle 33 is pretty blunt. All movement leaders are active disciple makers. No exceptions.
Yeah, the document stresses it's never done by proxy. Leaders are in the trenches doing the core work with everyone else.
Then Principle 34 lays out these 5 levels of leadership, but they're not titles like pastor or bishop. They're defined by activity.
Seed sowers and disciple makers, which the document implies is basically everyone. Then church planters, church multipliers, multiplication trainers, and movement catalysts. It's about function, not position.
So everyone's involved directly in the basics.
That seems to be the design. Principle 29 says new disciples were immediately involved in the whole process, leading others to faith and baptizing them.
Wow, baptizing too.
Yes, and Principle 60 emphasizes baptism and the Lord's Supper as core essentials, with all disciples expected to be making new disciples, baptizing them, and celebrating the supper together. No special class needed.
Principle 58 zooms in on young adults. It says their growth and maturity really took off when they were released to take full responsibility for everything: disciple making, church planting, teaching, leading.
Yeah, and Principle 56 gives some keys for how senior leaders could support them: being vulnerable themselves, affirming the young leaders' call, mentoring them, giving them real tasks, trusting them, and encouraging them along the way.
It really is a model built on raising up and releasing leaders from within, isn't it? Regardless of age or background.
That's the picture the document paints.
Okay, so this approach wasn't just about individual churches. It was clearly geared towards rapid, wide-scale expansion.
Definitely a movement mindset.
Principle 16 talks about an integrated regional model. Planting teams and local churches working together to plant more sustainable churches that immediately took responsibility for their own districts.
And Principle 30 confirms they weren't haphazard. They systematically worked through entire districts or provinces.
But not just strategy, right? Principle 32 says the Spirit's guidance was foundational to how they approached this regional work.
Right. It wasn't just human planning. And Principle 25 lists the ingredients: courage, a sense of urgency, relying on God's help and the Spirit's power, plus, sheer hard work.
Then there's the mention of Ephesus in Principle 40, a mission hub set up specifically for multiplying churches, like Antioch before it.
Yes, and Principle 42 makes a point of calling them mission hubs, not mission stations.
What's the difference, according to the document?
It's an interesting distinction in Principles 51 and 52. It contrasts these hubs with what it calls popular ministry centers. The hubs, it argues, practiced post-conversion gradualism, meaning after someone decided to follow Jesus, the focus was rapid formation into disciple-making communities.
Get them involved quickly.
Right, whereas ministry centers, it suggests, often follow pre-Christian gradualism, a slower process of engagement before someone makes a commitment, different focuses.
So the hubs were like accelerators, focused on reproduction.
That seems to be the idea presented. Principle 43 says planting a hub wasn't a 9-to-5 job. It flowed from this consuming vision to multiply disciples in churches everywhere in a region.
That consuming vision really comes through in Principle 54. No more place where Christ was not known, just saturation.
An incredibly ambitious goal. And Principle 64 suggests the document writers believe this vision is actually achievable.
But then Principle 63 throws in a critical caution, doesn't it, about why this vision might stall today.
Yeah, it's a challenging point. It argues the vision gets trapped in our methods.
That's right, pal.
When, according to the document, faith sharing gets left to the professionals, when we rely on witnessing by proxy, maybe through programs or events instead of personal connection, and crucially, when we start counting the wrong numbers.
Wrong numbers. What does that mean?
It argues we often track institutional metrics, building size, membership roles, offering amounts, but the document contends the apostolic focus, the real measure, should be qualitative and reproductive. Like, are disciples actively making new disciples? Are churches naturally multiplying into new churches? Are local mission hubs taking full responsibility for reaching their areas? It pushes you to ask, based on this document, what does success look like if it's measured by reproduction, not just accumulation?
Okay, we've mentioned the lack of buildings, formal funding, clergy distinctions. What other key things does this document highlight that made these early communities distinct from later forms of church?
Well, principle 1 is huge. The understanding that salvation was truly for everyone because Jesus demolished those major cultural and religious walls. Jew-Gentile, male-female, slave-free, those distinctions became secondary.
A radical inclusivity from the start.
Seemingly so. And Principle 11 adds there was no ambiguity about identity. New believers were immediately gathered, formed into these new church communities, no long waiting periods.
Principle 61 also makes an interesting point about where new movements often start.
Right. It notes that new movements of God frequently emerge from the margins, the disinherited, so we shouldn't overlook their potential.
But the document isn't painting some perfect, flawless picture, is it?
No, definitely not. Principle 19, even while describing their simplicity, explicitly states they were not without challenges, tensions, and divisions.
So internal conflicts still happen.
Yes, but Principle 18 makes a really significant historical argument. It acknowledges early divisions, but claims the fundamental essence of church changed dramatically later, particularly with Constantine.
Emperor Constantine, after Christianity became legal and eventually the state religion.
Exactly. The document argues that shift led to the rise of what it terms complex attractional models. That's hashtag 39.
Attractional models, meaning
Structures designed to attract people to a central place, usually a building, often led by professional clergy, reliant on institutional resources. The document contrasts this very sharply with the simple, decentralized, mission-focused, everyone-involved model it attributes to the apostles.
and it argues we're still living with the effects of that Constantinian shift.
That's the argument that we inherited structures focus more on gathering and maintaining institutions rather than empowering all believers for decentralized multiplication. It's quite a claim.
Wow. Yeah, that really does frame things differently. Okay, that was a really dense exploration.
Yeah.
64 principles is a lot, but grouping them like this really helps clarify the picture the document paints.
Yeah.
And it feels quite different from many common assumptions.
Yeah, what really jumps out is that relentless emphasis on radical simplicity, using existing relational networks, the Oikos, distributing responsibility for mission right down to every believer, that built-in drive for rapid multiplication, focusing on core actions, making disciples, baptizing, the Lord's Supper over, say, buildings or programs, and it all comes back to Jesus' death, resurrection, and the Spirit's power.
And the document's core argument seems to be that this very different approach is what allowed for such incredible growth and spread, even with difficulties. Maybe because it was so light on its feet, not tied down by infrastructure or external cash.
Right. It was fueled by the commitment and activity of the ordinary believers themselves, working within their existing lives.
Which, based on this document's perspective, leaves us with a pretty provocative question to think about, doesn't it?
I think so. It's something for you, the listener, to really chew on after this deep dive. If the document is right that the essence of church changed dramatically with Constantine, resulting in different models, what would it genuinely look like in our world today to intentionally try and apply the principles this document highlights from that earlier apostolic approach? Things like truly empowering all believers for mission in their daily lives, or maybe fundamentally shifting how we measure success, focusing on that qualitative multiplication rather than just the size of our institutions.
Definitely a lot to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Apostles' vision as presented in this fascinating document.